But first, Donald Trump will become the 47th president of the United States, much to the disgust of many journalists who tried everything in their power to convince Americans not to vote for him. And many of those arguments were simply lies, like the lie 1 week out from the election that he was violently advocating for a critic of his, Liz Cheney, to be shot by a firing squad.
4 days out from Election Day, and former President Donald Trump is escalating his violent rhetoric, suggesting one of his most prominent critics, the former Congresswoman Liz Cheney, should be fired upon.
And that take shot around the world.
Donald Trump has been accused of using dangerous rhetoric after suggesting guns should be trained on the face of Republican critic Liz Cheney. The presidential candidate is now being investigated over whether he's violated death threat laws just days out from the election.
It even fooled our taxpayer-funded media.
Donald Trump's comments about a prominent Republican critic have caused some outrage. Just tell us about those comments.
Joe, this has really overshadowed Donald Trump's Rust Belt push. He made comments with right-wing TV host Tucker Carlson about Liz Cheney, a former Republican congresswoman, but an outspoken critic of Donald Trump. And certainly there's no love lost between the two. But Donald Trump certainly took that acrimony a step further in that interview with Tucker Carlson, describing her as a very dumb person, a war hawk, and even raising the hypothetical, I guess, of her facing a firing squad.
So did Donald Trump call for a political adversary to face a firing squad? Well, according to Snopes, he did not. Despite violent rhetoric, Trump did not threaten to have Liz Cheney shot. In context, his words did not amount to an explicit threat against Cheney. Now let's listen to what Trump actually said.
She's a radical war hawk. Let's put her with a rifle standing there with 9 barrels shooting at her, okay? Let's see how she feels about it. You know, when the guns are trained on her face. You know, they're all war hawks when they're sitting in Washington in a nice building saying, oh, gee, let's send 10,000 troops right into the mouth of the enemy.
As Snopes confirmed, there was no threat to stand her before a firing squad. It was just a complete lie. Trump was making the point that people who advocate for wars or spout expansionist military policies probably would not like to be in a war zone where guns are pointed at them. It is so obviously false that even the ABC here in Australia had to issue its 53rd humiliating correction of the year. They write several news stories across News Radio and Triple J on the 2nd of November reported that US presidential candidate Donald Trump had suggested that former Congresswoman Liz Cheney should be, quote, put before a firing squad or have guns trained on her face and be shot. It added the full context of Trump's remarks, which would have made it clear he was criticising Cheney's alleged willingness to send Americans to war zones rather than advocating violence against her. It is worth pointing out the fake news about calling for a firing squad was published by the ABC all over social media in that clip that we just played for you earlier. And the correction from the ABC was only published after Trump won. And the video we played has not even been taken down. The media ran this lie everywhere in the lead up to the election, and journalists are wondering why people have started ignoring their criticisms of Trump. Well, joining me on the show this week is the Australian's Darren Davidson and the Daily Telegraph's Tim Blair. Tim, let's start with you. That was a rather extraordinary, can we call it journalistic sleight of hand, to truncate these quotes and turn them into something which you know, I know, everybody knows that's not what he was talking about. The problem I have is how it proliferated through the media so easily, how everyone fell for this in the lead up to an election when, by the way, these are the same people talking about misinformation every spare second that they could get an opportunity. And they've misrepresented this and made it seem like he's calling for the death of one of his adversaries.
It is absolutely a form of misinformation, and it reflects as well this incredibly disingenuous habit of the modern press, especially in regard to Donald Trump, to just pretend that there's no such thing as nuance or any kind of shade to it at all. I mean, if Trump had said, you know, inflation is sky high, the media presumably would have run with, Trump literally says that inflation is reaching the limit of the Earth's outer atmosphere. You know, it's been bubbling up in the press for a time, this kind of absurd literalism. I remember maybe 12 years ago we had a fact-checking organisation launched in Australia that one of its first efforts was to disprove a claim by a National Party MP that there were gold-plated coffee machines for the public service. They actually, no, I'm serious, you can look this up. They actually went through various, hardware store or suppliers or kitchen suppliers, couldn't find one that was gold-plated. You know, they busted that thing. And this has been rippling through. I'm not sure if it reflects more a diminution or an erasing of the ability to detect nuance, or if it's just deliberate being dumb. Your call.
I think there is a degree of stupidity there. And Darren, it's not the first time we've seen, Tim, you're 100% right about these literal takes. It wasn't that long ago that they were saying Donald Trump was advocating for a bloodbath. But when you listen to the clip, he's talking about there being an economic bloodbath in manufacturing, and I think it was motor vehicles specifically, motor vehicle manufacturing. He's talking with these, yes, they're inflammatory euphemisms and everything, but he's not advocating for violence in the way that they're trying to purport him to have done. But Darren, on this case, on this specific case, it's a few days out from the election, and you've got every major media outlet publishing a story that one of the candidates wants a political adversary to be shot by firing squad. Kamala Harris actually came out saying this should disqualify him from the race. It's pretty bad.
Yeah, it's interesting you've actually highlighted this clip, and it's one example of many because it reflects a pattern that we've seen throughout the campaign and throughout the election cycle. And that's where the media at large in the US has played this role of boosting Harris and the Democrats and taking things out of context. And that's played a big role in losing the election for them, because it's kind of created this bubble in which the Democrats are kind of disconnected from the real concerns of voters, whether it's border chaos, inflation, the economy, or crime. And, you know, probably the most famous example would be these continuous assurances that Biden was, as sharp as attacked. And, a good example of things being taken out of context in relation to that was the Group 7 meeting, I think back in June, where you saw Biden in video footage that you played on Sky, wandering aimlessly around. And we were told that he was fine and there was no problem whatsoever. And of course, that we soon learned that that wasn't the case, which we all suspected. But yeah, it's that example that you've highlighted and many others have created this bubble in which Democrats live, and they've just become completely disconnected from what's really going on in the minds of voters. And we saw that in the election result a couple of days ago.
Yeah, it's the ultimate boy who cried wolf, isn't it? I mean, I believe they called those clips cheap fakes. They couldn't say that they were fake, but they said they were deceptively cut. I don't know what was deceptive about him wandering around. It just is what it is. But they used the White House apparatus, and Karine Jean-Pierre was giving press conferences about how this was a form of misinformation. It's bad stuff, but let's move on, because it was an emphatic victory for Trump, and it was a rejection of the messaging contained in nearly every Hollywood movie, media report, or entertainment show. And how are these people coping with the reality of democracy now that their arguments fell short?
Let's be honest, it was a terrible night last night. It was a terrible night for women, for children, for the hundreds of thousands of hardworking immigrants who make this country go, for healthcare, for our climate.
A grown man literally crying because his political team lost. Or maybe because he has realised that no one cares what he thinks about political issues. It was also a little racist because Trump won off the back of a very strong minority vote. Not that a multi-millionaire celebrity would know anything about their struggles. And meltdowns were a theme across all the late-night talk shows and for the media more broadly. For Stephen Colbert, when his side loses, well, it isn't actually democracy at all.
So many of us wish this hadn't happened, but that is not for us to decide. This is a democracy. That's democracy with a capital duh. And in this democracy, the majority has spoken, and they said they don't care that much about democracy.
Let's check in on Jon Stewart.
My point is this.
Well, at least he's funny, but somehow the serious news types were even funnier.
Democrats need to be mature. and they need to be honest. And they need to say, yes, there's misogyny. But it's not just misogyny from white men. It's misogyny from Hispanic men.
Right.
It's misogyny from black men, things we've all been talking about, who do not want a woman leading them. Might be race issues with Hispanics. They don't want a black woman as president of the United States.
So there's just straight out racism, but then came the venom. The View turned on women, labelling them uneducated.
What we did not have is white women who voted about 52%, right, for Donald Trump. Uneducated white women, is my understanding. You have Latino men, actually, voting more for him.
These people were so upset because they have been listening to journalists like Joy Reid from MSNBC, who have been campaigning against Trump with segments like this.
We on this side of the TV screen have said all we can. We've laid out the stakes in this crucial election, where one side stands for freedom while the other meets the textbook definition of fascism, namely a far-right dictatorial regime like Hitler's Germany or Franco's Spain or Mussolini's Italy, but also white-ruled South Africa before Mandela and the black majority took control, or Vladimir Putin's Russia, Viktor Orban's Hungary, or Nicolas Maduro in Venezuela today, that suppresses the rights of women and minorities, uses the military to execute the whims of a strongman dictator, and controls and suppresses the press, education, the arts, rewrites history to suit a favored and dominant racial class, and foments extravagant corruption in order to enrich the dictator and his friends.
Well, let's go to Tim Blair now. There's a lot to unpack from that. One of the things that really jumps out at me is you got this Morning Joe host who is a white, wealthy man who all of a sudden now minorities aren't useful for him, and he just unleashes. They're sexist, they're racist. They don't know what's good for them, Tim. Why don't they know what's good for them?
Well, I think we've got to preface that by indicating, we've got to establish a baseline with Morning Joe's credibility. And that was that a few weeks before the big debate that demolished Joe Biden, Joe Scarborough, the host of that show, came out and said that he'd spent time with Biden, and that Joe Biden, this was the best Joe Biden. This was a guy at the top of his game. This guy was killing it, kicking it out of the park. Fantastic. And then we saw Joe Biden during the debate. So I don't think we can pay a lot of attention to that guy. Joy Reid, love the shirt, by the way. But when you go through all that stuff that she was saying about, executions and destroying the arts and, God knows what other comparisons she was making with historical figures of fascism, maybe before you compare Trump to those figures, maybe just wait until he's done one of those things. Just one extrajudicial execution, because he's been in power for 4 years, and this is what these people always sort of push aside. He's a known figure. He's a known issue. We've seen him for 4 years. For those exaggerations to be blurted out in the same frame that they slam misinformation, God, put a mirror on yourself, kids.
And Darren, they can't help themselves from talking about identity politics, linking everything back to identity politics. And the analysis, for me, has been missing very much for the most part, that this appears to be a reaction to the economic woes that a lot of the more impoverished people living in America are facing. And they cannot seem to bring themselves to understand why somebody who maybe is Hispanic, maybe is an immigrant themselves, would vote for Donald Trump when they are of a particular race. It's a problem in the media.
Yeah, look, we've seen right across the board in this election result, men, women have shifted their preference across the Republican Party, Latino voters, black voters, particularly males, people that earn under $100,000 US have shifted towards Trump, and white working class voters have, and even those that earn over 100,000. There's been gains there as well for Trump. Yet despite this empirical evidence, the post-mortem continues to maintain the fantasy, and then the truth is that voters are far more wound up about the economy, immigration, inflation, crime, after 4 years of being told the economy is in great shape, than they are about any question marks over Trump's character. And the other point to make as well is that the campaign was terrible. Harris completely failed to distance herself from Biden, who was unpopular, and at the same time failed to offer any solutions of her own. And that's why she lost the election.
Yeah, it's a really good point. Well, let's move on now, because the election didn't just expose major issues with the polling that we were showed. It also proved that celebrity endorsements just do not work. Now, rapper Cardi B was so upset that people don't care what she thinks about politics, she posted this message before having to delete it a few minutes later.
This is why some of y'all states be getting hurricanes. That's all I'm going to say.
Pretty disgusting stuff. Florida, Louisiana, Texas and North Carolina had all just been called for Trump just before she tweeted that. And of course, we still had Taylor Swift, Bruce Springsteen, Oprah, Lizzo, Eminem, and many, many more endorse Harris. But people ignored them. And now even The Guardian was asking this question. George Clooney, who cares? Did celebrity endorsements actually harm Kamala Harris? To answer this question, they went to an arts professor at New York University who finally stumbled on the truth. What matters to a celebrity isn't the interests of an average person. Beyoncé isn't worrying about the price of gas. Let's discuss with the panel. I mean, Tim, we've hinted about this. This is the theme of this election. This was an economic victory, the way that I look at it. And I look at it that there are a lot of people in America who are doing it incredibly tough, and you had an administration, or a woman who was a part of that administration anyway, the 2IC really, telling them that they fixed the economy, that everything was great and they should be thanked. It's actually a good lesson for the Albanese government, which I think is dipping its toes in the same sorts of water. But if you run on that campaign rather than have a policy-based election, it doesn't matter what celebrities say. People want solutions.
This is absolutely true. And, you know, I was given every impression. I think we all got the impression that the Harris campaign staffers were, by and large, very young. I mean, there was some photographs during the campaign of their staffers, of the Democrat team staffers. And they do look, you know, 25, 35, youngish for political advisors. Yet this whole campaign was very kind of boomer themed, like roll out the celebs. Bruce Springsteen, by the way, 75 years old. He's nursing class man at this point. It's getting kind of crazy with the elderly celebs, and as even The Guardian is now discovering, people don't vote based on what celebrities say. They don't even sort of buy household products based on what celebrities say. If Bruce Springsteen or Madonna or Cardi B, in brackets, who is Cardi B, close brackets, if these people recommended a washing machine, there probably wouldn't be a sales spike. People aren't into the celebrity thing in the same way anymore.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, Darren, I listen to various artists based on their music, based on their actual talents. I don't care who they vote for. That's not their training or their experience in life. Being famous or being a great singer doesn't really, for me, make them this kind of messiah. I know that the Democrats have to get people to sign up for voting. I understand that it's different to how it is here in Australia, where we obviously have the mandatory voting, and that galvanising that young vote can help. But it didn't work here. What's your take on this?
Yeah, look, completely agree. It's very clear that, we might like watching George Clooney in a movie or going to a Taylor Swift concert, but we don't want to be lectured by them. But, very wealthy individuals, ordinary families and workers and American voters are struggling at the moment. The cost of living is incredibly high, and inflation up around 20% in recent years, and that's absolutely astonishing. And we'll probably see. I don't think it will probably go up another 20%, but it might now stop going up at the rate it's been going up under Trump, and that's ultimately what people are voting for. I think more broadly as well, if you go back 4 years, rewind to when Biden won the presidency, he promised that there would be a smooth transition to the next generation of leaders in the party. That never actually happened, and he was hanging on and hanging on. Finally, he was moved out of the way. You had that Clooney op-ed in the New York Times, which everybody felt was really clever and now looks like a really silly thing to be proud about. And that just kind of thrust Harris to a top of the party without a proper process and left her very ill-equipped and ill-prepared for the campaign over the last 4.5 months or so. And that's ultimately cost them as well, because they were coming up against a candidate in Trump who clearly has a very firm grip on the electorate and their concerns and what's on their minds.
Yeah, it's a very good lesson for all of us in the media, I think, not to go so hard on these celebrity endorsements and really focus on the policies